Welcome to section 4.1, where we're going to start describing different characteristics of populations. Now, if you remember, a population is going to be a group of individuals that are going to be members of the same species, and so they're able to interbreed with one another to produce offspring. Now, with this, as we're describing them, there's three categories that we're going to use to describe them that we're going to go into in more detail, but I'm just going to give you a real quick thing. So we've got density, which is essentially going to be how tightly packed they are together. We've got range, which is going to be essentially where you find them, where they'll live, and distribution, which is if we look at an area where they are living, how are they packed together? You know, are they all going to be kind of smushed together in one spot? Are they evenly spread out? So distribution's kind of how they're dispersed, how they're located within their range. So, in more detail, population density, we're going to say this is how many individuals of that particular population there are in a particular area. So one way we can kind of illustrate this is to look at the map of the US and look at population density in the US. So this map is going to show us how many people there are per square mile. So a square mile is just going 1 mile, 1 mile, 1 mile, 1 mile to create this box, 1 mile squared. So as we do this, you can see that the red is ultimately going to be the highest values and white is going to be the lowest. And you can see that the US, while it has 330 million people, they are not evenly spread out. You can see that we have very high density around certain cities. You've got like New York City, you've got New Jersey, which that would be what? Newark? I don't know, it's New Jersey, we don't have to know. You've got certain parts that you've got that are much more dense that are cities. And so here we've got Cleveland, you've got Chicago, I believe, would be kind of what you're looking at there. I think that's Milwaukee. You've got probably LA, as I wildly guess, San Francisco, but we can see these pockets that are much higher, and those are going to be the cities that we see. You'll also see some of the dark green will be some of the cities that are a bit more spread out. So that's more like the Detroit area. That's going to be more like what we have here with Cincinnati, and I believe Columbus is going to be right there. So there's still pretty high densities, but not as high as, say, New York or LA. And then as we go on, we'll see that we've got large chunks that are practically uninhabited. So you've got, they have 0 to 1 person per square mile. So when you look at those densities, that would be like much of the Great Plains. You've got like the desert type areas of Nevada and parts of California. So there's going to be plenty of places that have very, very low densities. So this is one measurement to try to figure out how tightly organisms are packed. And the US, you can see that that varies greatly based upon where you're at. When you get to things like the deserts or the Great Plains, not many people. You get to the cities, you get along the coastline, you tend to get more people. Now, range is going to be where you can locate something, where you can find something. So here you'll see if we look at deer, the genus that contains the different deer species, you'll see that the brown tells us where they live. And so we can see they live throughout most of North America, South America, and much of Asia. There's some smaller ranges that we see them in Africa and along some of these islands, but we don't find them throughout most of Africa, most of Greenland because it's cold and inhospitable. We don't find them through much of what would be like the Himalayan mountains here, as well as Australia. We don't find them throughout those locations. So range is just going to be where can we find you. Now range will tie back into this idea of limiting factors and the zone of tolerance that we discussed before. Because oftentimes the conditions in these other locations where we don't find something is because it's inhospitable. You know, these abiotic or biotic factors are just not going to allow you to survive there. The other reason you might not find something somewhere is because they just can't get to that location. So you'll see stuff like Australia, there's a good chance the deer never could swim or make it successfully to that island, so they're just not there. Even if they could live there, they can't get to the actual place, so you're not going to see it. It's kind of like saying there might be this planet that exists a long ways away, so we can't reach it, but we could live there happily. But we don't because we can't get there. So for many species, you'll see their range will also be tied to the regions that they have access to. So zone of tolerance and limiting factors plays a big role, as well as this idea of where can you actually get to safely. Population distribution is just a pattern of how you spread. Now some things that tend to be territorial, or certain things like trees that tend to have a set radius that they kind of control, where they kill everything below it by just using up all the sunlight so other trees can't grow up underneath them. Those types of organisms can have a more uniform pattern, where we see that they're fairly evenly spread out. because each individual kind of takes up a certain amount of space, whether it's because it's their territory or, like I said with a tree, because they literally cover that area. And so it makes it where we see things roughly evenly spread out. You have some things that are random. This tends to be more like they use wind dispersal, and so just where they land tends to be a bit more up to chance. This one's by no means the most common, but it can be due to things like a method of dispersal that is fairly up to chance. And then we've got clumped, which is probably one of the most common, where we see them grouped. Now this could be because, like wolves, they might tend to prefer moving in packs. You know, they might tend to prefer existing in groups, whether it's a pack, whether it's a herd. And so oftentimes animals will want to group together. This could also be due to something like they need to live in a certain place, like along a riverbank. And so that means we're going to see them clustered around the riverbanks. But for the other parts, they can't get enough water, the conditions aren't right, it's outside of their zone of tolerance, so therefore we won't find them in other areas. And so this would also give us this clumped pattern where they tend to exist more along specific areas that fit their needs, you know, that allow them to survive, going back to zone of tolerance yet again. Now, limiting factors we've discussed before, and I tried to bring it up because these can be critical within that zone of tolerance idea as well. If the limiting factors are too severe, you can't thrive, or in some cases, if the limiting factors are present in high amounts, it can kill you. You know, it can prevent you from living there because the temperature is just too off. And so you can't cope with that temperature. It moves you to your zone of intolerance. So we're going to bring back up this idea of limiting factors to try to decide kind of how things live where they do, why they live where they do, and what helps control their population within the locations that they live. So we're not going to go through all of the abiotic, biotic stuff again. We're going to focus more how the density of individuals affects things. So we're going to focus on, you know, is there a difference between having just 2 rabbits or 3 rabbits living in some place versus what happens to them if we start to add in, you know, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, you know, how does the density of rabbits start to impact their survival? So first, let's look at the ones that it doesn't, called density independent, because these are easier. If there is something like a fire, it's not like if there's more rabbits around when that fire occurs that I'll be good. Fire is going to burn stuff and it's going to kill it, and it doesn't really matter how many individuals are there to be burnt in most cases. So density independent things are going to be oftentimes stuff that we'd consider like natural disasters. Okay, these things are going to be things that affect it, but if there is a flood, it's not like if there's enough of you that ultimately you'll be fine in the flood. Or maybe if there was just one rabbit, it would have not drowned. If there's a flood, you're going to drown or not based upon how much water's there. It doesn't really matter numbers that are present. So those are density independent things. If a volcano erupts and there's ash, you either breathe in the ash and it causes you problems in your lungs and you might die, or you don't. So density independent will oftentimes be these abiotic factors we talked about before, where if it's too cold, it's too cold. You know, if there's not enough water, there's not enough water. But there's also density dependent factors, which only tend to kick in if there's enough individuals to make it a problem. So this can be water in some instances if there's really low amount of water and there's a lot of people that need it. So you've got all these rabbits trying to drink from the one pool. So this could make water become a density dependent limiting factor, where if there were few enough rabbits, water wouldn't have been an issue. There would have been enough water. But now that there's enough rabbits, it becomes an issue. Food tends to work this way, where there might be plenty of food that's out there in the forest for 10 people. But if I now put 10,000 people there, there's not enough food for all of them. So they're going to have people die off. They're going to have people struggle because of food, because there's too many people after the same amount of food. It's just not enough to cover everybody. You've also got density dependent factors that in some cases could be things like oxygen in the water, where if we start to get an algal bloom, you start to drop the levels of oxygen. So the more people using it, the more they'd be affected in that particular case. You'll notice some things like oxygen might be both density dependent and independent depending on the scenario. You know, for us, if I drop the oxygen level near to zero in the atmosphere, we'd all just die. That would be density independent. But if we're looking at a lake where there's something using up that oxygen, so we now have essentially competition for oxygen, now we're talking density dependent. With density dependent, that's usually the idea here is there's some type of competition that's going on. So this could be trying to get food, this could be trying to get some resource, whether it's oxygen, whether it's water. You can have density dependent limiting factors like disease, where they ultimately have a hard time spreading when there's not many individuals. But when I ramp up the number of individuals, if one of these rabbits has a disease, that disease can be jumping over to everybody at this point because they're in such close contact. So that'll be this density dependent idea. You're doing great until there's too many people, and then things start to get really tough.